morning, and I think it's a very interesting one, especially for me, who is often trying to push the extent of the obligations that states have under the convention that I have some responsibility for. But my job this morning is to chair a panel that's concerned with the extent of the obligation to fulfill, as I like to put it to countries that are in front of me, to progressively fulfill the voluntary obligations that countries have entered into by not just signing, lots of countries, including this one, are great at signing conventions. It took us an awful long time, we haven't done it properly yet, after signing the Convention on the Rights of the Child to actually move in any bit of speed towards ratifying it. But the voluntary obligations that states have entered into and the way in which that perception, that sort of tightrope of the extent of the obligation is perceived by them and is perceived by rights holders. And it's a really important discussion at this point in time, in my view, particularly, as you were saying, Jamie, as we move into a situation where human rights are being challenged globally, and it's just been challenged very specifically by a change in the way global governance is done. You know, it's not just a challenge to human rights. And it is one that the global community is entering into fairly wholeheartedly, a change in particular in the contours of the global governance of migration, for example, as there's a current paranoia of what's referred to as the crisis, and in effect is a challenge to consider how best to move forward in that regard. But that's enough from me. In the first instance, I would like to introduce Helen Johnston, who is now Senior Policy Analyst at the National Economic and Social Council. And Helen, a number of you will know from the work she's done over many years with the Combat Poverty Agency, and also from her particular concern with matters associated with poverty research in that area. Helen.
Okay, good morning everyone. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak here this morning. I have 10 minutes available, and in that 10 minutes I want to address 4 issues. The first is the National Economic and Social Council's stated position on economic, social and cultural rights, the implications of the economic crisis for those rights, the extent to which economic, social and cultural rights are reflected in the programme for partnership government, and the 4th issue is the commitment in the programme for government to budget and policy proofing. So first of all, in the strategy reports of 1999 and 2003, which seems a long time ago now, the NESC recognised the importance of economic, social and cultural rights in underpinning policies on access to education, employment, health, housing and social services, and highlighted the need to explore the relationship between rights, institutions and public policy. While many economic, social and cultural rights are best achieved when they are co-produced by citizens themselves, the realisation of rights depends on the creation of effective institutions and a commitment to deliver on those rights. The NESC has argued that the link between social and economic rights, institutions and policies, and the commitment that is required is a loop rather than a line, and that you can enter into that loop anywhere. Therefore, the realisation of economic, social and cultural rights requires creating effective institutions and policies, which leads us then on to a focus on standards. This implies the setting of standards in consultation with citizens and service users, and as Jimmy Burton spoke earlier, he's argued that that should be more than minimum standards. It requires setting out benchmarks or indicators of progress towards meeting those standards, monitoring progress, and then holding those institutions accountable where they fail to meet those agreed standards. So it's legitimate to ask to what extent is that being achieved under institutions and policies in the aftermath of the economic crisis. And that brings me on to my second point. And we've carried out in ESC a study into the social implications of the crisis. It's not possible in the time available to go into those key findings today, although I'm sure they'll emerge in discussion. But I just want to make a few points relevant to rights issues. There are 2 factors to be borne in mind. First, as a result of job losses, financial losses, housing losses, many more people than heretofore became dependent, at least for a period of time, on the institutions of the state. And secondly, in response to the crisis, there was a huge programme of public sector reform, particularly in the areas of income support, employment services, further education and training, local government and community services, with new institutions being put in place. So what extent did our institutions and policies uphold people's economic, social and cultural rights in the context of the crash, and in a very difficult period for many citizens and also for the institutions of the state? While there were many people whose situation deteriorated at the time of the crash, those who were least well off and most dependent on the state before the crash continued to be so afterwards, and in terms of access to jobs and access to housing, probably went to the back of the queue. But policies and institutions do matter, for while there were some reductions in social welfare, the main payments were left mostly intact and protected people against the worst ravages of the crisis, except where they had huge debts. And that brings me then on to my third point, which is the extent to which economic, social and cultural rights are reflected in the current programme for a partnership government. In the programme, there are two mentions of economic and social rights. The first is in relation to the 8th report of the Constitutional Convention, where they recommended that the state progressively recognise economic, social and cultural rights subject to available resources, and that this duty be recognisable by the courts, and that specific additional rights on housing be inserted into the Constitution. However, the programme for government bats that commitment into the Oireachtas Committee on Housing for consideration, stating that substantial questions are raised on the balance of rights, on proper governance and on resources. So as we know, in spite of the government's housing policy Rebuilding Ireland, there is an acute shortage of housing in the state, and that many people are denied access to suitable accommodation. The second reference to rights in the programme for government is about developing a process of budget and policy proofing as a means of advancing equality, reducing poverty and strengthening economic and social rights. In the time remaining to me, I want to say something about budget and policy proofing in relation to reducing poverty, and I'm happy to elaborate further in the discussion afterwards. Poverty proofing was introduced into government departments in 1998, following the publication of the National Anti-Poverty Strategy in 1997. Poverty proofing was reviewed by the National Economic and Social Council in 2001, and then subsequently improved and extended. It was reviewed again in 2005 by the Office for Social Inclusion and substantially revised. It was renamed as Poverty Impact Assessment, involved a screening process and a 7-step process including publication of the results, which have been called upon by the community and voluntary sector. It has since been retitled as a Social Impact Assessment and carried out by the Social Inclusion Division of the Department of Social Protection. In the 19 years since it was first introduced, a number of policies have been poverty-proofed, not that many, but some have. Memoranda to government contain a statement about the impact of a policy on poverty, among other things, and budgets have been analysed for their impact on poverty by the Combat Poverty Agency until its closure in 2009, by the Department of Social Protection and the Department of Finance, and also by the ESRI. The general conclusion is that poverty proofing has raised awareness about the need to take into account the impact of policies on poverty, but that it hasn't really influenced policies in favour of reducing poverty. However, the mechanism itself and the tools available have been greatly developed. And returning to my initial comments about the need for a commitment in the loop, as well as rights and policies and institutions, I think if the commitment was there, budget and policy proofing could be used as a means of advancing equality, reducing poverty and strengthening economic and social rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. I'm particularly struck by your reference to the National Anti-Poverty Strategy and linking that to the point that Jenny was making earlier about the importance of international instruments. And sometimes I think the importance here of European instruments and EU instruments is something that we can't underestimate, particularly in the discussion we're having today, and also by your final point about commitment, effective institutions, standards and accountability within that will also require commitment if we're to go anywhere with them. The next speaker on the panel, who equally will have 10 minutes, is Colin Harvey.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My time is short, so I'm going to try to be as brief as I possibly can. Three things that I want to say today. I think the first thing is, I think we need parity of esteem and equal treatment for socio-economic and cultural rights as a matter of urgency. I think we need to end the second-class status of these rights on this island, north and south. That means taking forward the recommendations of the Constitutional Convention. It means a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland that includes social and economic rights. Ireland needs to ratify the optional protocol, and we need to make these obligations meaningful in practice. So I think domestic enactment of social and economic rights is desperately and urgently needed. I think all branches of government can play a part in doing that, as well as civil society. The executive has a role, the legislature has a role, and the courts have a role. And it's time for Ireland, I think, to take constitutional ownership of economic, social, and cultural rights. That's my point one. Point two, in relation to the legal obligations. There are a range of economic, social, and cultural rights obligations across a range of instruments. I think the nature and extent of these legal obligations are clear. Jamie has highlighted those this morning and laid those out very clearly. There are also multiple forms of guidance. The Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, through its general comments, through its concluding observations, has set out very clear guidance. A number of organisations in this room have intervened and provided guidance in relation to that debate. There's international, national and regional guidance. And if I dare say this myself, I was involved in a superb and excellent Queen's project on budget analysis on economic and social rights. And we provided very clear guidance too, in terms of how you might take some of this work forward. In terms of the obligations, I think it's clear what the immediate obligations are, in terms of taking steps, in terms of non-discrimination, in terms of the minimum core obligations. I think it's clear in terms of what is needed on the achievement progressively of full realisation, and I stress achievement and full realisation of these economic and social rights. I think we know what it means when a state experiences economic difficulties. We know that measures in relation to austerity should be temporary, they should be necessary and proportionate, they should be based on non-discrimination, and they should protect minimum core obligations. We know in this room that these things have been done elsewhere. Legal measures are in place constitutionally, legislatively around the world, and we know that a variety of forms of human rights-based budgeting, participatory budgeting, gender budgeting, alternative budgeting have been done elsewhere. So my second point is the legal obligations, I think, in international law are there, and their extent is clear, and there is guidance available in taking those forward. And a second point is there's clear evidence that this can be done, and I think it's quite plain, and I want to be clear today, that it's time that it should be done and steps should be taken. Third, I was asked in what is probably the most detailed and precise speaking notes I've ever had at any conference I've ever spoken at, to say something about budgets. So my third point in relation to budgets in human rights, it seems absolutely clear to me, and be very conscious that I do not want to fall off this podium as I'm delicately balanced here myself, that in order to meet the international legal obligations that have been set out, I would say that a rights-based approach to budgeting is actually necessary. If you want to seriously, as a state, demonstrate that you're taking deliberate, targeted, concrete measures, then I think rights-based budgeting is a way to do that. It's also a way, and we found this with our budget analysis project, is we're all used to in this room, right? We're all used to politicians at the first time we mention socioeconomic rights. We know the objections. But instead of moaning about judges and the judiciary, surely it's time for our legislature, executive, for politicians to take ownership and show leadership in relation to socioeconomic rights. And one way to do that is by embracing a human rights approach to budgeting. Human rights budgeting, then, is a way to show political leadership for all branches of government to take their role and have a role and part in this. Budgets are important because budgets are clearly evidence of what a state prioritises, right? The budget is where the priorities are set out. Is enough thought being given at the moment to tax justice and the effective generation of income, as opposed to simply making cuts? When cuts in budgets are proposed, are they necessary? Have alternatives really been explored? Is there a meaningful, transparent and participative process around that? Where steps have been taken to address economic problems, are those steps definitely temporary? Can you evidence the fact that they're necessary and proportionate? Are they genuinely non-discriminatory? And are minimum core entitlements protected? Who is suffering most in that context? When additional resources become available, what is prioritised when those resources become available? Are rights realising initiatives prioritised, or are they not? Are resources being used efficiently and effectively? And I suppose a point raised by the Committee on Economic and Social Rights in its concluding observations in Ireland, do we actually know? And can we answer those questions effectively? Do we actually have the data to answer those questions? And I think budgeting would help. So simply, economic, social and cultural rights budgeting will assist in guiding everyone in a rights-regarding way. And it's one way, I think, for legislatures and executives, for politicians to show leadership and take ownership of the human rights agenda. Now, rights-based budgeting is not going to solve or address all the issues. It's not going to solve qualitative issues around the quality of services that people receive. It's not going to deal with the need for effective regulatory regimes, right? The money might be there, but you might have a woeful regulatory regime that doesn't achieve the objectives that you want. But what it clearly does is signal that economic and social rights are publicly valued. So a budget approach, a human rights-based approach to budgeting then, shows that economic and social rights are publicly valued, and it will complement, I think, other mechanisms. So the third point I want to make and stress is, I think in order to fulfill some of the international legal obligations we've heard about today, you need to do human rights-based budgeting. I think you cannot, when Ireland comes to report back, if it reports back on time in June 2020 to the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, a robust human rights approach to budgeting will help in the process of answering some of the questions that are going to be raised there, as well as showing due respect for economic and social rights, and also complementing other mechanisms. So just to end there very briefly, and look, let me be clear, resources and costs come up a lot in these debates. But democracy, the rule of law and human rights cost. Civil and political rights cost. Having a democratic system costs. Economic and social rights are no different to that. In fact, one of the things I would point out is a robust approach to human rights budgeting that includes socioeconomic rights might actually save you money by taking a harder look at the way you are budgeting at the moment. My question would be, what is the cost of not respecting and protecting economic, social and rights fully? I think the cost is the development in Ireland of a society where the script for a person is written from the start, where your socio-economic status ultimately determines how you live, how you die, and ultimately when you die. A society of socio-economic inequality and division, ultimately, in my view, a fundamentally unstable and divided society. It's difficult again to see how Ireland can meet its international legal obligations without a robust form of rights-based budgeting. It will make the assessments more meaningful and transparent. It will make reporting on progressive realisation easier. It will assist in generating data. It will help to identify inefficiency, waste, underspend and unfairness. But ultimately, it seems to me, I end where I start. We desperately need, in Ireland, north and south, parity of esteem and equal treatment for economic, social and cultural rights. And ultimately, for me, that is about allowing the story to change, to give everybody a chance, a real and meaningful chance to participate in society, to create a better, healthier, more vibrant, and ultimately, I think, a more stable society. In other words, for me, I think it's time to embrace this change. It's time for the equal treatment of economic, social and cultural rights in Ireland. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Colin. You've got a little bit more than 10 minutes, but thank you for that very timely reminder that every choice the government makes actually costs money, and the choice not to spend money on economic, social and cultural rights is equally a choice, particularly also for your focus on parity of esteem. Now, I think we still have questions to ask about this interpretation of the extent of the obligation, and I look forward to Jerry White's comments in that regard. So, Jerry White, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anastasia. And again, just to thank the organisers for inviting me to present here today. Now, the organisers asked me to address 5 questions, and I've provided them with some material that I understand will be posted subsequently. But in common with the other panelists, they've given me 10 minutes to address these 5 questions. So even with my reading cert maps, that works out at 2 minutes per question. So fasten your seatbelts. First question I was asked to address was what obligations rest on the state under international and European law. Now, I would answer this question by differentiating between 3 categories of international obligations. First of all, obligations under various UN conventions, or covenants rather, and under the European Social Charter. Secondly, under the European Convention on Human Rights, and thirdly, then under the EU law. In relation to the former, I detail some of these obligations in the notes, but in relation to the former, the key thing to note is that the furthest we have gone with regard to UN and European Social Charter obligations is to ratify them. And that simply means that they are binding on us at the level of international law. We have not taken the further step of incorporating them, which would mean that they are enforceable in domestic Irish law. And so if you want to enforce or rely on any of these covenants, you really have to rely on the international enforcement machinery that's there, which I would say operates essentially in a political arena. You can use that machinery to generate political embarrassment for the state. But in terms of going into the Irish courts, relying on, say, for example, UNESCO, there's very extremely limited possibilities there. Talking about a law's disadvantage in terms of domestic justiciability. With regard to the UN Convention on Human Rights, the situation is a little better because we've got an act since 2003 that does allow the Irish courts, or indeed requires the Irish courts, to have regard to our obligations under the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, that convention is largely concerned with civil and political rights, but it has had some positive impacts in the Irish domestic scene with regard to some socioeconomic rights, notably, for example, in relation to eviction procedures governing public sector tenancies, but also dealing with the right, say, of children who are taken into protected detention for their own good. The convention can be relied on in domestic litigation, but the remedies are somewhat limited. If you establish a breach of the convention, the courts can award you damages, which obviously could be helpful in a socioeconomic context. But the only other remedy they can grant is what's known as a declaration of incompatibility. They can highlight to the politicians that there's some discrepancy between what the convention requires and what we're doing, but they can't force the politicians to take any action on a specific declaration of incompatibility. Finally, then you have EU law, and of course that is very pervasive and intrusive into the Irish legal system, and does have significant impact in certain areas, most notably around free movement of workers, which, for example, would require coordination of social security rights. So if you can locate your ESC claim within EU law, then the question of going to the Irish courts is very much a runner. There's the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, which also contains obligations referring to, among other things, economic, social and cultural rights. It looks very attractive when we look at it first and think, great, we've reached the promised land, but then you come to Article 51, which tells you that these provisions are only referable to where European Union law applies. So unless the European Union has some competence in a particular area, the Charter won't apply to that situation. Okay, one question down, 4 more to go. Second question I can answer very quickly because Jamie has already answered. But this is what obligations would rest on the state of ESC rights were given explicit protection in Irish law. And as Jamie pointed out in his presentation, essentially there's a duty to respect, a duty to protect, and a duty to promote. And probably the duty to promote is the most controversial one with regard to ESC rights, because that requires the state to take positive steps to assist and foster the enjoyment of all human rights, including ESC rights. And that does raise the question of public expenditure and as Jamie highlighted, the relationship between the courts and politicians in the political process when it comes to public expenditure. Again, as he pointed out, ESC rights are generally qualified to take account of this because ESC rights would usually be guaranteed having regard to the availability of resources and also having regard to this concept of progressive realisation, accepting that member states or state parties could progressively or over time move towards full realisation of the rights in question. Question number 3 is coming to my own area, I suppose. How can separation of powers doctrine be reconciled with ESC rights? And of course that's the big issue in the Irish context, where the Irish courts have interpreted the doctrine of separation of powers, which allocates powers as between the legislature, the executive and the courts. The Irish courts have taken the view that issues of what they call distributive justice are not matters for the courts, and issues of distributive justice really are what we're concerned with regard to economic, social and cultural rights. So the current position of the Irish Constitution is that if you want to claim that you have a constitutional right to housing or a constitutional right to healthcare, the courts do not consider that they have the authority to entertain such a claim. They would regard that as a political demand which should be addressed by the legislature and or the executive. The point I would make here, of course, is that the Irish people have the power to amend the Constitution, and there is no constitutional reason why the Irish people could not amend the Constitution to provide for justiciable economic, social and cultural rights. In other words, the Irish people could say to the judiciary, well actually, we do want you to take a role here in enforcing these rights. And as it happens, the right to free primary education is already in the Constitution, and that is a justiciable right that the courts do have to enforce. The South African example, of course, is probably the best example there is of a constitutional order where separation of powers was modified to allow the courts to enforce ESC rights. And that is something that we could do in our own system if the political will was there and if there was popular support for such a move. The penultimate question I was asked to address was, how do ESC rights look like in states that have protected them? And what I've done here really, I'm not going to go through them, is simply listing the materials. Provisions from the South African Constitution dealing with housing, healthcare, food, water and social security. and education, and also the rights of children, and also nearer to home provisions from the Portuguese Constitution 1976. The Portuguese have a number of provisions, quite a number of provisions dealing with ESC rights, and have extracted the more interesting ones and reproduced them for you to look at later. Of course, you don't necessarily have to, or indeed at all, have to rely on a constitution to protect ESC rights. ESC rights can be protected by legislation. In our own system here, for example, social welfare rights are based on legislation. In other jurisdictions like France or Scotland, for example, there's an enforceable statutory right to housing that I mentioned briefly in the notes as well. The key difference, of course, is that statutory rights are susceptible to being modified or amended by subsequent legislation, whereas constitutional rights would require further recourse to the people if they were to be changed in any particular way. And finally, the last question I was asked to address is how have ESC rights been adjudicated upon other states, and what checks and balances have been put into place? And it seems to me, and this is getting back to this question of the relationship between courts and politicians, it seems to me there are two questions that arise here that need to be addressed, and I would emphasise that these are questions of policy, I think, more so than questions of law. But the first question that we need to consider when we're talking about the protection of ESC rights is whether or not you would go for a system which requires the courts to protect minimum core obligations, where the courts would have some role in saying what are the minimum standards that have to be complied with in relation to a particular right. The argument here is that such an approach would ensure that the rights of the holders of the interests of the holders of these rights would get priority over other concerns like, say, resource issues. And there is some experience, limited experience, in the Irish situation of the courts enforcing minimum core obligations, as Jerome Connolly points out, in a negative way around, say, for example, standards with regard to housing, hoarding sites for travellers, where the High Court on 2 occasions said the standards in 2 particular hoarding sites were not up to scratch. But the concern around, I suppose, the minimum core approach is that the politicians will not like this. It gives the courts more power than perhaps the politicians might be willing to concede, and indeed that the court might be happy to take on. And there's also the concern, of course, that even if there is a minimum core approach being used, if the court sets the standard too low, you're stuck with that. That can be a problem. The alternative approach, which is the one taken in South Africa, is, I'm generalising here, broadly for the courts to review state action or inaction against a criterion of reasonableness. I'm generalising here quite a bit, but it's broadly the idea that the courts would consider whether or not, having regard to a variety of factors, including the availability of resources, whether what has been done or not done is reasonable. And this is the advantage that, it does reflect or respect the notion that the legislature and the executive have technical expertise or access to technical expertise that the courts don't. And it might also be easier to sell politically. The politicians might be open to amenable to the argument that with this approach they still remain in control, albeit that the courts have a more limited form of oversight. The second question that needs to be addressed here, and again I'll go into it in a bit more detail in the notes, is whether or not, if you're enforcing ESC rights, you will do it within what we in the trade call a strong form of judicial review system, where the courts are essentially they have the last word, or whether you would do it within a system of weak form judicial review, where it would be possible for the politicians, even after the courts have pronounced on an ESC right, it would be possible for the politicians to come in and modify the judicial decision in some way. Again, that's sort of a policy issue. A number of commentators certainly think that ESC rights should only be enforced within a weak form of judicial review. Our legal system, when you look at the Constitution, is a strong form of judicial review, but again, If you wanted to amend the Constitution, you could provide for ESC rights being governed by weak form judicial review. For example, if you were to say that it would be that you would do something akin to the Declaration of Incompatibility of the 2003 Act, of course, it would use that type of remedy where they're adjudicating on ESC rights, but have other remedies when they're adjudicating on civil and political rights. So, as I say, there's more in the notes, and apologies for the hurried presentation.
Thank you very much, Jerry, and in particular thanks for taking us, for capturing the complexities, not just of reinforcing the fact that there is an understanding of the extent of the obligation, but that in effect the question is dealing with the complexities of how implementing that obligation can be seen either as highest common factor or lowest common denominator, and the various mechanisms and excuses and complexities that can be put in the way of making that possible. Now, we did start late, and I think we may have a very short window for a few questions and comments, and somebody in the back of the room is nodding, that's great. So if people would like to make a question or make a very brief comment, you have a maximum of 2 minutes within which to do it. And 2 minutes we will do the business of ringing the bell. If I can make the watch work so I can see the 2 minutes. And there is, and maybe you'd identify yourself. And I think if you just stand up, you might hear the rest of it.
Fiona Walsh, I do some advocacy around human rights in the mental health system, and I suppose I can identify with what Jerry particularly said around human rights budgets, based budgets, but also I don't think anybody mentioned having human rights, passing human rights based and equality based compliant legislation, and we're still passing legislation in the mental health disability arena that is not compliant. Amendment of Mental Health Act, capacity legislation, none of them are CRPD compliant, and we're still doing that. Department of Justice, Attorney General, how do you make them aware, how do you get them to actually step up on our legislators to question and pass human rights and equality proofed legislation? And the other point just too was in relation to the right under CESCR to attain the highest, standard of mental and physical health. All the money in budgets is going towards, 95% of it at least, is going towards the medical model. So that needs to be challenged as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Fiona. Anybody else? Yes.
Two hats on the INTO Equality Officer, and I'm also a Labour Party councillor. Jerry, when you mentioned about education in the Constitution, if my memory serves me correct, it's the provision for education as opposed to education. It's almost like a get out of jail clause, because it means that we still have fees for education. The other question I have is particular, I suppose, to my council role, and it's housing. And I see more and more where we have people who are working and cannot afford rent, so they're going into the welfare system, which sometimes means they have to give up their work, so they're being denied their economic right to provide a livelihood for the family, and go into the welfare system in order to get support for housing. So my question is, do you think our fiscal rules, or the EU fiscal rules that we're always told about, that we can't spend capital to build houses, is that an infringement of human rights at an EU level? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Is there anybody else who wishes to make a comment at this stage? Still taking it all in. But I can now revert then to colleagues here, if one or other of you would like to make some.
I can take one point made by the last speaker. I'm afraid I know nothing about EU fiscal rules, so I can't address that. But just on the very specific point of education and the Irish Constitution, the Constitution obliges the state to provide for free primary education. So as far as first level or basic level education is concerned, everyone is entitled to have that provided. The Constitution is entitled to have that provided free of charge. Of course, that leaves open the question of second and third level education, where there is some similar constitution.
Thank you.
The point about Fry's notes, one of the things I was talking about was budgeting. But the reason we felt economic, social, and cultural rights budgeting helps us is that there's often, as we know, and it's much valued, but there's often an over focus on the courts and the judges, and that tends to put the politicians off in a sense. But in terms of budgeting and human rights budgeting and equality budgeting, and thinking about what you're doing before you do it, it's part of that broader agenda. In a sense, it's trying to build and mainstream human rights into the legislative process so that they're taken seriously at every stage in the legislative process as part of the democratic system, so that in a sense you don't make those mistakes. You're not having to defend your actions because you've thought about them in advance. And I do think, and I would uphold the role of the courts and justiciability in relation to this area, but I think by adopting a budgeting approach, you get the entire system thinking hard at the start. And I think many of the problems we faced in the past in these sorts of areas could have been addressed if people were taking a harder look at budgets, were taking a harder look at the regulatory framework for financial services, for example, as part of an economic and social rights budget-based approach. So I think it's about assisting to think harder, to take these rights seriously. Second point is, in relation to, one of the things we should underline, I'm conscious that with the European Union flag here behind me on the day that's in it today, of course, I might be allowed back to Belfast, we'll see. The EU itself, human rights are part of the foundational values of the European Union. And I think just as we should think about economic and social rights budgeting in relation to Ireland, we should also be asking hard questions about the application of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU to the EU institutions themselves. Are the EU institutions living up to the foundational values of human rights of the European Union? They didn't live up to the foundational values of human rights during the austerity programme, and I think it's an excellent question. So we should be asking hard questions of the EU itself about living up to its own foundational values at all stages, which include human rights and include economic, social and cultural rights.
Jackie, just to come back on the question, you asked about legislation, because whenever poverty proofing was introduced, it was supposed to be applied to legislation as well as to government policy programmes, memorandum of government and so on. But that it was never applied, in my knowledge, to legislation. So that's obviously an area that we still have to go through.
And we have the Disability Miscellaneous Provisions Bill to ratify CRPD. Again, it's not, they want to have derogations, declarations on Articles 12 and 14, for deprivation of liberty and denying legal capacity. So.
Okay, are there any very quick comments? Anybody else wish to say anything?
It's more of a technical question. Yeah, you just mentioned something in your talk, sorry, John, about court in the UK last week or the week before, saying that there was a right for somebody to have criminal activity investigated.
Yeah, so the European Court under Article 3 has already said that where somebody makes an allegation that they've been a victim of inhuman or degrading treatment by, for example, commission of a serious violent offence, then they have a corresponding duty, entitlement to the state investigating and prosecuting the perpetrator of those offences. And so where the police are found to have not done that, for example, to be most prevalent in the context of allegations of rape, where the police's track record is terrible, the courts have been enforcing that by using human rights in certain senses where the common law, the ordinary law, doesn't give people that entitlement. For the very same reasons people are opposed to economic social rights being enforceable. Oh, that's a question of policy, it can set resources, the courts have got no involvement in the proposal. And the debate that the Supreme Court was having was whether or not it was sustainable to say human rights did indeed have that as part of their component, and I'm sure they're going to say that it is not sustainable. Can I add to one of this? Yeah. Can I just add to because I thought it was a very interesting comment about the right to health and the differential between physical and mental health. And I think there's a susceptibility in all of us to say, oh look, we're funding all of this particular concerns in this context of physical health to the detriment of something else, like mental health. I think we should be very careful about viewing things in that way. It may be entirely necessary to fund physical health to the tune that we are, and also necessary to allocate additional resources to fund mental health problems. So that competition is one which a proper economic social rights-based framework would actually militate against rather than encourage. Just one very small point about that in relation to budgets. One of the things that budgets are so good at, hopefully, is tracking longer-term objectives in a way that sometimes our politicians are less inclined to do because they tend to think about the next election. I'm very much in favour of those budgets. Nothing I said about the courts was meant to suggest otherwise. However, enforcing economic social rights sometimes includes enforcing the minor, if you like, process-based components of that right. And so if you're going to have an obligation to do human rights-based budgeting, you need to have the courts able to say you haven't done a human rights-based budget here and enforce that. Doesn't mean the courts decide what the budget should look like, it just means the court can at least tell the legislature you need to do this. And if you don't have that backed up, it looks like law, it looks like guidance, it looks like the kind of stuff they'll use when they want to and they'll disregard when they don't want to. And I'm not in favour of that approach to the enforceability.
Thank you very much, Jenny. I think we probably need to finish at that. Could I just say that I think the morning session that was taken in your own input area has very clearly laid out the extent of the obligation and also created a context for discussing further the complexities of what the implementation of that obligation might look like and could look like. I think that the point that there are roles for everybody, for all parts of the system, is a really important one, and I'd like to suggest, and I can't be blamed for doing this, but I think there's a very important role also for civil society in that regard, and one that perhaps is underestimated. A role also from where I sit for special measures, because I think if we think that economic, social and cultural rights can be implemented in a way that one size fits all, we're not going to get anywhere. We are talking about women, children and men, and we're talking about travellers and settled people in this country, and we're talking about a whole variety of different groups who need to be named otherwise, and the measures taken to ensure that they're included as well. And I do have to say as well that I think it's useful just now to recognise that at least in one small area, the cultural rights of one group have been recognised in the more recent past. And I'd like to take the opportunity to say well done to all of you who worked so hard to ensure that travellers' rights to their identity have at last been acknowledged in the Irish Parliament and the law. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Anastasia, and thanks to Jamie, Colin, Helen and Jerry. We really look forward to the papers afterwards, which will elaborate on the points that we're making. Can I just, for those of you who are fully paid up members of the Twitterati, the hashtag is ESC IRE17. We're now going to look at the right to food. So lunch is available on the door on my left. If you could bring it back to your seat, because we're going to cut the lunch a little bit short because we overran just a little bit. But you'll have an opportunity then to have a chat with other people, etc. And we reconvene then. Sorry.
Any members of the ESC Rights Initiative that are here, we're going to try and get a photo while we're here. So if any members of the initiative could meet on the steps of the actual mansion house and rather than the oak room here. And now, we'll take a really quick photo and then you can get back in for your family.
Okay. Thank you.